Well, I guess I believe this. First of all, um, I think we have to recognize that mental health and addiction go together, and that addiction is a serious issue in our society. I think it's much more serious than people are prepared to recognize. I think when I talk to people about it in their communities, they all recognize that it's a problem. And one of the things we have to realize is that it's a mental health and medical problem. It's not a criminal justice problem, or it shouldn't be. Or the way to solve it is not through the criminal justice system. And we make a huge mistake as a society when we believe that if you ban something, that you've solved something. You know, it's a very human error, right? You say, I don't like that, so I'm going to ban it. Let's make it illegal because we don't like it. And then you think, well, now I've solved that problem. And when you when I listen to the conservatives in the House, it's very interesting. You know, you ask them a question about criminal law or something, and they'll say, oh, we've passed a law on that. You know, that's, and the criminal code, when I went to law school, the criminal code was this thick. And now the criminal code is like that thick. And you say, what exactly have we solved? So we have to recognize that the attempt to deal with the problem of addiction and the problem of intoxicants in our society, the effect they have on human health, the way to deal with that is through the criminal code, I think is a mistake. And I don't think my opinion, I've had this opinion for a long time, and at one time it was a relatively radical view. I don't believe it's a radical view today. The BC municipalities just passed a resolution at their meeting in Vancouver of all the mayors, little towns, Smithers and Terrace and Prince George, as well as Vancouver and downtown, uptown, everywhere, passed the thing we should decriminalize marijuana. And I think we need to think this thing through very carefully. And this again is one of the things our new leader's going to have to do with the policy, saying, well, what does the policy really mean? How do we work with the provinces on this question? But let me give you just some very practical examples. It is very difficult to get a young teenager who's got an addiction problem into treatment. We don't have enough places for treatment. We don't have enough places that are taking care of that person. We don't have the access to those facilities. They don't exist. You can have families in this province and in this country whose kids are wayward in terms of their activity, and they're going through all of the horrible, acting out that kids sometimes go through. And they've got to send those kids to the United States or somewhere else to try to get care because they can't get the care, they haven't got places here. At the same time as we recognize that in our prisons today, drug use is widespread. And addiction is a significant issue in our prisons. If you look, when we dealt with booze, which is the two most dangerous drugs today, are booze, alcohol, and cigarettes, in terms of the number of people that it kills, and the number of people who get addicted, and the number of people who can't get off the addiction. We've reduced cigarette use to under 20% of the adult population. But we still have young girls and young boys in the schoolyard in grade 6 and grade 7 who are buying individual cigarettes from a green garbage bag from some guy who's got them tax-free, and they're getting them virtually for free. And after they've been on it for a year or two, they're hooked. So what we do on drugs has to be comprehensive, and it has to be thoughtful. And it isn't a matter of No one is in their right mind is going to celebrate the drug culture. That's not what it's about. It's about saying, how do we manage this problem? There was a time in Belleville and in Trenton and in the county and everywhere else where you wanted to get alcohol, you had to go to the doctor, and the doctor would write you out a script that said you need it for medicinal purposes. That was the level of hypocrisy that we were reduced to as a society. And that's how we're treating marijuana today. And it doesn't, we just got to come to grips with this question. And the last thing I want to say is this, and I feel this very deeply. We cannot let Mr. Harper and the Conservatives define this issue for us. We have run away, collectively, progressive parties have run away from dealing with issues around the criminal justice system, around addiction, around what's happening, because we're so afraid, we're going to be accused of being soft on crime. We have to be smart on crime. And we have to be tough on crime. We have to be tougher even more on the causes of crime. And we have to recognize that no society has ever incarcerated itself into security or safety. It doesn't work. Sure. I think it's, first of all, we have to recognize that a couple of things. One is when we were a middle power, coming out of the Second World War, we were one of the few countries left standing. So let's understand that. It was an amazing time for Canada because we hadn't been attacked, our infrastructure hadn't been destroyed, and yes, we had huge debts, but we were still standing. And so we were the fifth largest economy in the world. We were doing well, and so much of the world had been devastated. 25 million people killed around the world. So, we played a role, but we also have to understand now, the world is a much different place. But there's still a lot of very positive things we can do. I think the biggest mistake the Conservatives have made is they've been so simplistic in how they've looked at things, of saying, well, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, and we join up with the good guys, and those are the bad guys. You have to understand in the world that there are all sorts of interests that we have, and there are competing issues that we see at work, and we need as a country to be engaged in a thoughtful way all the time. I know there are many people who think, for example, that, Afghanistan, Pakistan, let's just get the hell out of there. Let's just give up. And I think that's a big mistake. I believe you've got to stay engaged. You've got to figure out, how do we reduce extremism and hatred in the world? How do we deal with the sources of violence in the world? How do we engage with other countries in trying to figure out what it is, what are these forces that are creating this hatred and creating this violence, and how do we deal with it? And understand that, as it is with many other forms of activity, you've got to understand it before you can deal with it effectively. And yeah, you have to be prepared to act militarily in some circumstances, but you also have to engage in every other way, because we know that a military intervention often has consequences that you cannot predict. And consequences will go well beyond what you anticipated would happen. When the Americans went into Iraq, Vice President Cheney said on television, they'll be throwing flowers in front of our feet. Well, that's not what happened. And so a couple of $1 trillion and a couple of 100,000 lives later, you realize that that isn't exactly what happened. And the same is true of every single intervention. And by the way, that's also true of interventions that are even sometimes being contemplated. I'll tell you one interesting story, because it happens to be true. I don't think I've told it publicly very often. Last spring, I met with space of 2 weeks, I met with the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Israel. Now, for those of you who don't know, they're members of different parties. And they don't agree with each other. They've been lifelong rivals. The Prime Minister is Prime Minister Netanyahu. He has a very simple view. Very direct, very eloquent. Iran's developing a bomb. We can't let them develop the bomb. We have to take it out. If you don't take it out, we'll take it out. Okay. Peres was very interesting. He said, okay, let's say if one was to bomb Iran. He looked at me and he said, Mr. Ray, what do you think would happen next? And what do you think would happen after that? And what are the consequences of what that would mean? You know, consequential thinking is one of the most important. There's a difference between consequential thinking and impulsive thinking. Consequential thinking, you say, if I do that, what's going to happen? I mean, sometimes, I'm sure we've been through it, but even in question period or something, somebody will say, I'm going to say this in question period. And I'll say to them, well, what do you think he's going to say back to you? So you say that, what comes after that? You got to think about that. You can't just say, I'm going to do this because I'm mad and this is the right thing to do. So Mr. Harper goes to New York, and he gets this award. Great. But why wouldn't you go and speak to the General Assembly? Why wouldn't you go and talk to a range of people and say, here's our view, here's what we stand. Why wouldn't you meet with a number of Arab leaders that you've never met with before as Prime Minister? Why wouldn't you take the opportunity to meet with the new President of Egypt? Why, yeah. He may be somebody you might not agree with. He might represent views that you don't like or you're not familiar with. But that's the guy you got to talk to. Again, the President of Israel, who's a very wise man, by the way, Shimon Peres, very smart guy. He said to me, you don't negotiate with your friends. You negotiate with your enemies. You don't have to make peace with your people you like you make peace with people you don't like. And this is something we have to understand as a country. So, this is to say nothing of how we've lost ground on the environment. We've lost ground on so many areas. Mr. Harper proudly went down to New York to accept the Man of the Year award or whatever. He didn't go to Copenhagen to accept the 24 fossils of the lifetime that Canada has received because of its position on the environment.